What if Def Leppard were a thrash metal band? That's the scenario we're going to be imagining on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which a change of circumstances causes this song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it in order to bring this alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Rocket by Def Leppard, and as per a viewer request from a couple of weeks ago, I attempted to turn that into a thrash metal song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So, as is probably the case for a lot of people around my age, Def Leppard were probably one of the first rock bands I was ever really aware of being a pretty constant presence as they were throughout the 80s. I guess maybe the first song I heard would have been Photograph, which is a cracking song, but then I really started to pay attention around the time of the Hysteria album, then the big string of hit singles that followed. Pour Some Sugar on Me, the title track, Animal, and this song, Rocket, which I first heard as the single edit when it came out. I think it was probably the last single from the album, and I thought it was a really striking song. Very, very unusual, quite minimal. About sort of 75% of the original track is drums and sound effects, and a riff and a little backing vocal hook. There's scarcely any song to it, really, but it's really different to anything else that you would have heard at the time, and kind of pretty different to anything that anyone's released since, really. So yeah, all those singles made a pretty big impact on me just when I was getting into rock music at the time. Wasn't really aware until a few years later of the band's history, and it was quite interesting to look back and sort of see them coming from that start of the 80s new wave of British heavy metal scene that also spawned the likes of Iron Maiden and Saxon, the Tigers of Pantang, Diamond Head, all those great bands. I certainly always associate that new wave of British heavy metal scene with a pretty tough denim and leather, hard-hitting heavy metal sound. The sound that sort of you'd think of as kind of traditional metal now, heavy street-level metal with a little bit of punky attitude in it. And that's certainly nothing I would have ever associated the Def Leppard that I grew up with. Obviously, by the time I heard them, they were already this highly polished, radio-friendly, stadium-filling pop rock product. So it was really interesting to, many years later, go back and listen to those early records, particularly the debut On Through the Night from 1980, because you can hear the roots of that more polished Def Leppard sound in some of it. I mean, certainly the song Hello America really tips their hand early. It's got early elements of that pop polish that you associate with them, and it's got the keyboards, a bit of kind of extra radio-friendly sheen. But then there are other parts of the record that really do kind of place them firmly in that more straight-ahead new wave of British heavy metal camp. You can hear all the separate influences a bit more clearly before they came together into this signature Def Leppard sound completely. So there's obvious elements of UFO in there, who I think are a really kind of underrated band in terms of the development of hard rock in the latter end of the 70s. You can certainly hear a big Queen influence, particularly in those harmonies. I mean, Def Leppard's harmonies are one of their signature traits on this record. They're definitely moving towards that, but the obvious influence is Queen. There's also bits of Thin Lizzy in there, some of the riffs, some of the lead work, maybe some AC/DC in the riffs as well. So all these elements. Joe Elliott's voice, interestingly, hasn't really got to its signature sound yet. He sounds a little bit lacking in confidence on some bits. There's a few notes that he's going for and he doesn't quite nail them because he's just holding back a little bit. Also hasn't quite developed his outrageous, ridiculous American American accent that he uses that doesn't come from anywhere at all. So everything's working towards what we later think of as the Def Leppard sound, but at the same time, there's some bits that do sound a bit more like what other new wave of British heavy metal bands were putting out. I'm particularly thinking of the song It Could Be You, which is very much more along the lines of the kind of faster, harder hitting end of new wave of British heavy metal that Diamond Head and Iron Maiden were doing. It's really got a bit of that early Deep Purple kind of Speed King feel to it. Rattles along at a cracking pace, got some palm-muted proto-thrash rhythm guitar work in there, and it's all done in just over 2 minutes. So that's kind of an interesting signpost to a direction that Leppard could have taken if they hadn't wanted to go more down the kind of stadium pop metal route that they ended up taking. While Def Leppard did use the new wave of British heavy metal as a springboard towards this pop metal sound that's one of the defining sounds of 80s radio-friendly rock, along with Bon Jovi and a few of those other giant bands, there were plenty of other bands who used that same late 70s, early 80s British metal scene as a springboard towards a much harder, heavier sound, which of course became known as thrash metal. It's a fascinating genre, produced so many great records, and it can definitely be largely traced back to that new wave of British heavy metal. Obviously, if you want to go a bit further back, you can trace some roots back to the very earliest heavy metal sounds. You could say Speed King, as I mentioned, by Deep Purple, or Fireball. Some of those early, really speedy, hard-hitting Deep Purple songs are proto-thrash, I guess like Paranoid and Symptom of the Universe by Black Sabbath, Communication Breakdown by Led Zeppelin, all have elements of this up-tempo, pummeling, hard-hitting sound with a kind of palm-muted riffing that came to define thrash. But really, the bands that came out of Britain in the late 70s and early 80s did just sort of take that foundation and raise it up to a new level of intensity. Particularly, obviously, Motorhead, who I mentioned a lot in these videos, got to be a vital influence on this. Just faster and more aggressive than any heavy rock band had been before. Phil Filthy Animal Taylor's double kick work, using 2 bass drums to create this machine gun kind of rhythmic attack. That was so important in the development of thrash. And then obviously you've got Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, who both have this precision, razor sharp twin guitar attack that came to be a hallmark of a lot of thrash bands as well. There's a lot of bands just taking that Motorhead speed and intensity, some of the Sabbathy weight and the discordance of the riffs, the use of tritones, all that stuff, combining it together. And then obviously at the same time as these metal bands are going, you've got the punk scene coming through, so they're feeding on the energy and the attitude of that, taking some of the speed and the directness and the aggression of punk and just blending that into the mix. So from that, you get the new wave of British heavy metal, but then some bands within that scene, as the punk scene is getting faster and more aggressive, they're responding to that increased speed and aggression and applying that to the metal they're playing. And I guess the first one of those that really springs to mind would be Venom from Newcastle, a band probably whose importance to the development of music far outweighs their own abilities as musicians. The Welcome to Hell album, which came out I think 1981, is a real landmark in the development of intense guitar music. Probably you could call it the first real extreme metal album. It's a new wave of British heavy metal album, but at the same time, arguably the first black metal album, arguably the first thrash metal album, just by taking Motorhead / Iron Maiden attack and combining it with elements of the emerging kind of second wave British punk bands, likes of The Exploited and Discharge, who are playing a really stripped down street level, super intense, high speed, very aggressive form of punk rock that in turn also took from some kind of heavy rock bands, particularly Motorhead. Following closely on the heels of Venom, you get other bands in different areas of the world who presumably were developing in this direction of their own accord, taking that British metal sound and combining it with elements of UK-82 punk and also American and Scandinavian hardcore punk as well, creating a new form. So in the wake of Venom, you get some bands who combine that speed and aggression with a more traditional heavy metal level of musicianship. Venom, those records are great, but they're pretty rough, barely in time, just kind of ragged as hell. But you start to get bands coming through like Metallica, and then after Dave Mustaine is ousted from Metallica, Megadeth coming through, Slayer in LA, Anthrax over on the East Coast, just bands who have that similar mix of metal and punk with very, very solid musicianship and in some cases a bit more of a sophisticated approach to songwriting. So instead of just being kind of verse, chorus affairs, they start to develop more complex songs where they have multiple sections, different timings, more elaborate instrumental sections. So that kind of more progressive element becomes part of it as well. So you've got those big four bands in the US, along with the likes of Exodus, who are a really important early Bay Area band, probably playing that style before the likes of Metallica, but didn't get recorded until later, so didn't really get the credit. In South America, you get the likes of Sepultura coming through, who are fantastic. A really raw take on kind of Slayer style thrash with elements of crust punk in there as well. In Germany, particularly, you get a great scene emerging with bands like Sodom and Creator, who play a really dark, vicious strain of thrash that goes on to be a massive influence in the development of black metal as well. In the UK, you get bands like Sabbath and Onslaught, who both had some pretty epic stuff going on. So anyway, the point is, this stuff was developing all over the place. And by the mid-80s, with Metallica releasing their big breakthrough albums, Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, and Slayer obviously delivering Rain in Blood, thrash just becomes a pretty massive deal. By the late 80s, when the whole kind of pop metal, hair metal scene was at its height, thrash metal really was kind of the main alternative to that. If you weren't into that more polished style, thrash was seen as a more true representation in metal, this kind of street level, tough, gritty alternative music. But yeah, for this week's track, I was actually given the challenge of trying to turn Def Leppard into a thrash metal band by one of my viewers over on my Facebook page. I really liked the idea, so I decided to have a go at it, and just thinking of how it could have come to pass that in an alternative universe, Def Leppard were a thrash band. And to be honest, it's not one of the more far-fetched ideas, really. You don't need to come up with a convoluted scenario to imagine that. I mean, you can hear in that first record on tracks like, as I say, It Could Be You can hear that if they'd just pursued that direction a bit more, they could have ended up pretty much following that line. So for this week's alternative universe scenario, I just suggested we go back to the early 80s. Def Leppard have already released that first album. They're gearing up to do High and Dry. They've got the songs written, but then Rick Savage, I just picked a member of Def Leppard. It could have been any of them. Rick Savage comes in wielding his cassette, and he's like, listen to this, lads. I've just heard this. It's blown my mind. This is the future of where metal's going. So they all have a listen to it, and they're a bit unsure, but they can hear there's something exciting going on there, and it's Venom's first demo tape. So after listening to it a few more times, Rick's managed to convince them that this is the way we've got to go. So they go back to the drawing board with the High and Dry songs and rework them so they're all a bit more along the lines of this faster, harder style that they've heard on this Venom tape. And obviously, while they're in the process of reworking the songs, they're hearing other music. They start to hear bits of second wave British punk like Discharge and GBH, and also some early American hardcore like the Circle Jerks. And so they're incorporating all of this into their music. So by the time High and Dry finally comes out, they've remolded themselves into this early British thrash band. So that's the sound that you hear on this version of Rocket, which obviously I'm suggesting is from one of their later albums as they've continued on this style. It was good fun trying to create a thrash metal Def Leppard. I picked Rocket over any other song just because A, I knew it pretty well, and B, I figured it might be a little bit easier to convert to thrash than some of the other songs, just because at least the verses have a bit more of a monotone kind of barked delivery rather than some of the more overtly melodic stuff that they did. As is always the case with these things, the first step was just getting the isolated vocals and dropping them into GarageBand, getting them synced up to the grid. Then accelerated it quite a lot because, with thrashing, I wanted it to be up-tempo. I also cut loads out because, Rocket is not a short song, particularly the full-length album version, and there's a lot of just instrumental stuff in it, a lot of drums with sound effects, all of that had to go, so just jettisoned all of that. And then the next step was working out some vaguely thrashy sounding guitar riffs that I could build the track upon. Obviously, thrash is a very heavily riff-based genre, so that was pretty important. So cobbled together some riffs that fit in with the chord structure of the song, did a scratch guitar part with those on, and then I programmed some drums in, loads of double kick, quite a lot of time changes, going from half time to double time, a few dead stops, just the kind of stuff that you hear typically in thrash songs. I played some bass on. I did have a comment on Reddit saying, "Oh, there's no bass on this at all." So that's how you can tell it's a thrash metal record. And I guess a lot of thrash stuff does have the bass pretty low in the mix. And obviously the famous example is Metallica's "And Justice for All" album, where the bass is pretty much mixed out of existence. But I would like to point out there is definitely bass on this. Didn't do anything too fancy with it for the most part. It's mainly just either doubling the guitar or playing root notes pretty tightly in sync with the kick drum. But it is definitely there, and you would notice it if it drops out. Got rid of my scratch guitar and put on some proper guitar tracks, just a pair of rhythm guitars that play all the way through. I'm not used to trying to play that tightly, that fast. I'm not really a metal player, so it took quite a few goes, but I got there in the end. And then just to beef up the choruses, I did a couple of extra rhythm parts in there, so I think the second and third choruses have these extra rhythm guitars that come in too, just to kind of fatten those up and add a couple of extra elements as well. And then a lot of thrash records have some fairly kind of shreddy lead parts, which I was kind of dreading. I'm not much of a metal lead guitar player. I can't really shred, but gave it my best shot. So there's a few little lead breaks in there. And then the main solo, I used two different guitar sounds just to kind of get that dueling lead guitar thing you get on Slayer records and Megadeth records. So I guess the first one has the whammy bar, dive bombs, and in my mind would have been a bit more like a Kerry King kind of thing, but just sounds like me panicking. And then the second one's a little bit more melodic, and ideally that would have been more like a kind of Marty Friedman from Megadeth thing, but I absolutely can't play like him, so I did the best I could. And then for the video, I found some good footage of them playing the song, synced that up with the track, and then interspersed it with just some footage of some 80s metal people having a good old thrash metal time. So teens having a bit of a bedroom headbanging session and various thrashers at different gigs just rocking out. And obviously, as usual, I managed to pop in a few ineptly photoshopped period gig posters with Def Leppard inserted on there too. So hopefully those gave you a bit of a laugh as well and gave it a bit more of a correct thrash scene aura. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it anyway. I had a lot of fun making this one, so I hope you had as much fun watching it. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. I always really appreciate that. And if there's anything else you'd like to see me do in coming weeks, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, any songs you'd like me to have a go at, or any artists you'd like me to take a look at, do also let me know. But yeah, otherwise, that's it for me from this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll see you next time.